What makes a good antagonist? Developing a compelling antagonist is something that takes a lot of skill, and there are a number of ways in which this can be done. Presenting a seemingly overwhelming force for the good guys to eventually overcome is certainly one route, with Ryuji Goda fitting the bill within the Yakuza series. Creating a really despicable character to root against also works. You only have to look at the likes of Joffrey from Game of Thrones to realise that people really love to see a villain get their deserved comeuppance. In Yakuza, characters like Jingu and Iwami exist for that oh so satisfying moment when Kiryu finally gets to serve the smackdown on them. Personally, however, I enjoy a more nuanced approach to developing an antagonist, keyword here being antagonist rather than villain. Creating a character that the audience can relate with, however tiny, but equally struggle to support, can help develop a compelling narrative and set up some interesting and complex dynamics. On the more extreme side of the argument, a villain like Thanos threatens with literally wiping out half a universe's population, but his indiscriminate approach and genuine belief that what he is doing is for the greater good makes him a character that you may not agree with, but at the very least can understand to at least some extent. As far as genocidal maniacs go, we've definitely seen worse. Akira Nishikiyama is a character in the Yakuza series that definitely fits this more nuanced approach. He is not a brutish force, nor a character that exists just to make you hate his existence. Nishiki is a complex character that, due to his personal relationship with Kiryu, makes for a potentially great antagonist. Welcome to the Gaming Conversation. We make regular gaming critiques, discussions and investigation videos. If you enjoyed today's video, please do consider giving it a like and subscribe for more content coming out soon. This video will contain spoilers for Yakuza 0 and Kiwami/Yakuza 1. And, without any further intermissions, let's discuss the tragedy of Akira Nishikiyama. The title of this video is an intentional double entendre. Akira Nishikiyama is inherently a tragic character whose story throughout Yakuza 0 and Kiwami is full of emotion. At the same time, while I love his character in so many ways, there are some glaring issues in the presentation of his character between Yakuza 0 and Kiwami. Having been introduced to the series through Yakuza 0, Nishiki was a character that I immediately warmed to. His cool, materialistic yet caring self acted as the perfect counterweight to the unapologetic, salt-of-the-earth heavyweight that is Kazuma Kiryu. Their brotherhood was one of the many reasons that made Yakuza 0 for me one of the best games in the series. Between the initial karaoke sesh, suit shopping shenanigans, Nishiki's tears as Kiryu vows to take on the Dojima family, and then to their climactic team up at the end, their relationship is a fundamental aspect of Nishiki's character. Yakuza 0 does an absolutely fantastic job at developing a strong brotherhood between these two. Kiryu's story is definitely the weaker of the dueling protagonists in 0, but the dynamic between him and Nishiki is perhaps the strongest in the entire game. In many ways, 0 also does a great job of foreshadowing future issues between the two of them. Even the smaller scenes between them, like when they go suit shopping, allow for the writers to show to players that there are some noticeable differences between the two. Nishiki, whilst likeable due to his charm and quick wit, is absolutely a materialistic character who believes he can work his way up through the Yakuza hierarchy through image rather than force. This mentality completely contrasts with Kiryu, who, as we know, builds his legend through sheer force and is driven by a distinct, albeit simplistic, moral compass. When Nishiki tries to talk Kiryu into leaving the Tojo clan, Kiryu remains defiant because of his desire to protect Kazuma-san. Kiryu, from this perspective, is a stubborn character that will absolutely choose the path of most resistance, even if the odds are ridiculously stacked against him. Again, compare this to Nishiki, who is Yakuza more in image than action, and what you have are the seeds for a great conflict between two opposing ideologies, made all the more impactful by the strong bond that these two brothers share. Add in two very awesome voice actors, and it is hard not to be excited. The other great seed planted in 0 is the inferiority complex Nishiki clearly has towards Kiryu. More subtle than regularly trying to outmuscle him, the game hints at how much Nishiki looks up to Kiryu. Nishiki's tearful admission that he cannot kill Kiryu and is nothing without him is brilliant, and again contrasts with how well composed Kiryu remains throughout the scene. Kiryu even tells Nishiki to bring his head to the Dojima family to help him ascend the ranks. That piece of dialogue alone says so much about their relationship, and provides an interesting parallel to Nishiki earlier in the scene, when he states that he will kill Kiryu to save him from the Dojima family. Both, in a unique way, are acting selflessly in this situation. However, you can also recognise that this is a damaging and painful experience, especially for Nishiki. Now, I didn't know for definite at the time what exactly the writers were building towards with Nishikiyama. I mentioned at the start of the video that Nishiki is not portrayed as a brutish force. This idea feeds into the inferiority complex. However, this isn't to say he's presented as weak. This is a very important distinction here which we'll delve into later in the video. Suffice to say, the game does a good job of demonstrating that Nishiki can handle himself in a fight. As hopefully is apparent by now, Yakuza 0 does a masterful job of developing a Nishiki as a character that the audience can empathise with. Naturally, the majority of this development comes from his interactions with Kiryu, but even smaller examples, such as when Nishiki stands in Majima's way to protect Kiryu and Makoto, at least in his mind this is what he's doing, shows another side to his character. Furthermore, the design of his character, the general flashiness of his red suit, his fancy hair and koi tattoo, all exist to directly contrast with Kiryu. Yakuza 0 sets up a number of potential big payoffs for Nishiki's character arc. Could we see a future playable protagonist? How will Nishiki continue to fare in the harsh Yakuza world? And how much will their opposing ideologies lead to Kiryu and Nishiki diverging from one another? All exciting hypothetical questions that I was looking forward to having answered. So when I finished Yakuza 0, completely swooned by such an incredible gaming experience, and then had my first glance at a copy of Yakuza Kiwami, I was immediately taken aback and intrigued by the box art. Why is Nishiki placed parallel to Kiryu, with a new slick back hairstyle and such stern expression? Could he be a new playable character? But then, a darker thought manifested. Is Nishiki the bad guy here? My curiosity piqued, and I was excited to explore another Yakuza adventure after absolutely adoring 0. All the great seeds planted in 0 unfortunately yield mostly unsatisfying results in Yakuza Kiwami. Having said that, the game does try and explain the dramatic shift in character between 0 and the original Yakuza game for Nishiki. Let me preface this section by saying I'm very aware that Kiwami is a remake of the original Yakuza game. As I've explored in my previous analysis of Majima, Kiwami as a title has some issues with inconsistent presentation, with Yakuza 0 retroactively making Majima, and in this case Nishikiyama, more complex and interesting characters than they were in the original Yakuza game. The original Nishikiyama in Yakuza 1 is not at all well developed. The remake does put in considerable effort to make the character more complex, and flashbacks are used regularly to explain the shift in his persona from Yakuza 0 to Kiwami. The problem is, the execution itself is inconsistent, and a lot of the interesting ideas laid out in 0 are not built upon. Nishikiyama's character development in Kiwami occurs very differently than it did in 0. I spent a great deal of the previous section speaking about his relationship with Kiryu, because this dynamic is how the writers explore the depths of his character in the previous game. With Kiwami, however, Nishiki's character development happens less through interactions with Kiryu, and more so with circumstantial changes. This is both a good and bad thing, but the way the game distances his and Kiryu's relationship from the forefront of the narrative is a problem that we will explore. First, however, I want to look at what Kiwami does quite well. Yes, it isn't all 0 good, Kiwami bad. There are two big developments that cause a dramatic shift in Nishiki's character, which ultimately lead to him becoming an antagonistic figure. His sister Yuko, who is briefly mentioned in 0, becoming ill, and him murdering Dojima, which ultimately leads to Kiryu taking the fall and ending up in prison. Both events are significant enough to act as a catalyst for character change, and with the right execution, could lead to a sympathetic antagonist who is not driven by cliché, bad guy motives. The ideas are certainly there, but Kiwami's execution of Nishiki as an antagonist doesn't live up to the fantastic potential that both games lay out. Let's look at the issues first that are actually handled quite well in Kiwami. Nishiki having to ascend the Yakuza ranks, starting his own family, all with the motivation to generate funds to save his sister, makes him incredibly sympathetic. This is crucial for the type of antagonist the game wants to present. Nishiki's motivations are driven, much like in Zero, out of care for a loved one. Juxtapose the initial cool, fashionable character we get with someone who deeply cares about his family, and you might just be creating a good protagonist. This is what the writers should be aiming for. Nishiki isn't bad because of his nature, but because of circumstance. Again, this is something very relatable, and the growing desperation he displays throughout Kiwami, in an effort to save his sister, makes him extremely sympathetic. Him being manipulated by the Doctor and abused by his subordinate are also important developments that push him towards the edge. Nothing seems to be going right for Nishiki, knowing all his efforts to save his sister in vain, and that he doesn't even have the respect of his own men, push him to rock bottom. The scene with Shimano is just sad, as he cuts through Nishiki like a piece of dirt. All of this makes Nishiki look weak and pathetic, which compared to other Yakuza antagonists is a lot more interesting. The murder of Dojima by Nishiki, who is trying to stop him from raping Yumi, is an extreme, life-altering event. Kiryu ultimately taking the fall for Nishiki and ending up in prison also feeds into the inferiority complex that is subtly developed throughout Zero. This is brilliant. The game continues to build on this idea. Nishiki overhears some unaware Yakuza family members suggest that the situation of what to do with Kiryu would be easier if Nishiki was the killer, because he is not Kazuma's favourite. This reinforces the idea that Nishiki is lesser than Kiryu. An even more impactful scene happens after this incident. Reina, who holds romantic feelings for Nishiki, berates him for what happened. She mentions that Nishiki promised he would protect Yumi. This is already such an interesting parallel to Kiryu, which the game doesn't build on enough. Kiryu as a character always strives to protect his loved ones. He isn't perfect on this front, but certainly at this point in time, Nishiki's perceived failure to protect Yumi, and Kiryu taking the fall, builds upon this inferiority complex. Reina consistently questions Nishiki. How could you let this happen? Why couldn't you save them? And that last simple, how? This scene is just brilliant, and presents Nishiki as a powerless figure. These are questions that throughout the series are rarely directed towards Kiryu, who more often than not succeeds in protecting others. The scene reaches a brilliant crescendo when Nishiki accuses Reina of calling him useless. This isn't what she's saying, but it's certainly a thought that Nishiki has about himself. His frustration escalates into him slapping her, which is a dramatic shift in his behaviour, and speaks to a character that is about to erupt. There is no brutal lashing out or any other over-the-top theatrics, just a single act that hints at a dark descent for a deeply insecure man. The seeds are there, a man who sees himself as powerless and weak, a brotherly figure who is anything but, with growing resentment stemming from deep insecurities and increasingly tragic circumstances, the potential for an epic tragedy. Alas, when Nishikiyama finally becomes a true antagonist, the execution is subpar. Up to this point, the characterization of Nishikiyama has largely been fantastic. Players are presented with a likeable and relatable character who is regularly brought down by tragic circumstances and a harsh environment that he's clearly not cut out for. All of this acts as a brilliant setup for a complex antagonist that the player is already emotionally invested in. Sadly, this is where things begin to fall apart. Kiwami does a great job of building Nishiki towards a breaking point. The scenes I discussed in the previous section all work excellently. However, the scene where Nishiki finally snaps, I feel like it undercuts a lot of the nuance that the game had developed with the character up until this pivotal moment. The initial image of Nishiki picking up his blade while the thunder reverberates against his dimly lit office is powerful. The implication that he is going to commit suicide is incredibly sad. Matsuhige, his abusive subordinate, enters and there is a fantastic tension. Once again, the writing up until this point, where Nishiki snaps, is quite good. Matsuhige manages to touch on many of Nishiki's insecurities. But then Nishiki snaps, and suddenly for me, things start to feel a bit too comical. The slicking back of his hair with his blood is certainly a creative decision. Unfortunately, it is about as subtle as a hammer hitting a wall, and completely took me out of what is otherwise an incredibly dark scene. It feels like the writers really wanted to make it clear that Nishiki is now a bad guy. But I think part of what made his character great, up until this point, was how subtle the changes were. Nishiki declaring that he'll kill as many people as it takes to reach the top feels incredibly cliche, and instead I think a lack of dialogue would have been beneficial here. Let the players sit with the ramifications of what's just happened. I'm sure many of you will disagree with me on this point, but for me personally, this scene feels lazy, and it is made even worse by how little development he gets after his turn to the quote-unquote dark side. The original Yakuza 1 script gets in the way big time here. Jingu is a terrible antagonist who takes up a lot of screen time that Nishiki could have occupied. Controversial one here even, but Majuma's exploits in the game also feel like a distraction that isn't well integrated into the central narrative. As a consequence, Nishiki suffers as an antagonist, primarily due to just a general lack of presence. All of his build-up demands interesting interactions between him and Kiryu, but what we get is sparse and lackluster. His multiple indirect attempts to take out Kiryu undermine the strong bond that Zero expertly crafted. He feels like an impersonal figure at this point, an antagonist held down by an outdated script. Their reunion at Serena after 10 years should be a massive moment. Some of the dialogue lightly touches on their brotherhood, but the scene is rushed, and Nishiki's admission that he shot Kazuma feels way too sudden. Kiryu immediately hitting him also takes away from the tension that could have been reserved for their inevitable fight. There is a simplicity in the interactions between these two that I didn't enjoy. The guy did literally serve 10 years on your behalf, Nishiki, and yet this issue isn't touched on at all, nor do you write to him, which I think is incredibly strange. I think that the tension between the two should have slowly built up throughout the game, with Nishiki actually feeling like the central antagonist. Don't place these two immediately against each other. Keep hidden who shot Kazuma until later on, and keep building up to the point where it's clear that Kiryu and Nishiki will have to fight. I think all of this would have made the conflict that much more heart-wrenching. Compare the emotion in this reunion scene to the one in the woods between them in Zero, and try to tell me that the latter is not more compelling. To give the game some credit, there is one scene that occurs after Nishiki's change that I think is absolutely brilliant, and develops an important plot thread from Zero. The scene where Kiryu visits the tattoo artist who designed both his dragon and Nishiki's koi tattoo. I'll admit, I'm a sucker for the tattoo symbolism in Yakuza, and this scene is one of the best examples of this. The koi crossing the river to enter the Dragon Gate foreshadows the inevitable conflict between these two. For Nishiki to surpass Kiryu, he will have to face the dragon, much like with the koi swimming upstream. This is such a simple and short scene, but it helps to build tension between the two, even when Nishiki is off screen. And then the game kind of forgets him, at least until the final chapter. All the rubbish with Jingu takes away from Nishiki's screen time, and then we are suddenly about to have our final confrontation with him. This massive moment we've been building up to across 2 games. Admittedly, the fight itself is badass, with emotional music reflecting the weight of the conflict. But a badass fight is basically a given in the Yakuza series, kind of the bare minimum. The game pivots to Nishiki wanting to take Yumi from Kiryu, rather than focusing on more interesting plot points, such as Nishiki being inferior to Kiryu. I mean, you could say that them fighting is about that, about Nishiki finally proving to himself and to everyone else, but even still, the scene fails to live up to the great expectations that both Yakuza 0 and Kiwami set. I also disliked how the fight ended. The lack of interaction between Kiryu and Nishiki at this point is disappointing, and the immediate shift to Yumi and Kiryu makes Nishiki immediately feel like an afterthought. There is no room for the player to sit and take in the emotion of what has just happened. I get that Yumi is a significant character to Kiryu, Nishiki and Haruka, but after all the writers have done to make Nishiki so compelling, this moment deserved more. He deserved more. Then Nishiki sacrifices himself. This scene is so jarring to me. First of all, it features Jingu. Yep, that's all I need to say on that one. Secondly, whilst the actual sacrifice itself is kinda cool, in the moment, it feels so sudden because the game fails to continue to show Nishiki as a conflicted character after his turn. This could have been a great moment of pathos. Nishiki, a character undone by circumstance and constant tragedy, making one final heroic sacrifice and finally protecting his loved ones. Instead, this moment feels random and unexpected, not in a good way, and next thing we know, he's gone and quickly forgotten. It left me feeling empty. There is no great payoff between Nishiki and Kiryu. I was waiting for the emotional embrace that just never happened. The Tragedy of Akira Nishikiyama as a character is an absolutely brilliant origin story. We get to watch a lovable brother who is as caring as he is charismatic become beset by tragedy and overcome by his insecurities. We are presented with a natural conflict that will be so raw and emotional, and there is the potential of an antagonist that we can relate to and desperately want to help. Alas, the Tragedy of Akira Nishikiyama as an antagonist, constrained by an outdated script with very little payoff, is even greater. Thank you all once again for tuning into the gaming conversation. Today's video was a difficult one for me, with regular script changes and conflicting feelings directing the course of my script. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider liking and also subscribing, as we have plenty of more content on the way. I would also love to know what you all think of Nishiki as a character. No doubt I've made some very strong statements here. Some of you might agree, some might disagree. Let me know in the comments and let's start a conversation. Once again, thank you all. I've been Michael JH, and at times absolutely heartbroken by the tragedy that is Akira Nishikiyama. Peace.